self-esteem, without hope, and that would be tragic. In Psalm 81, we have a psalm that starts out by calling God's people to worship and all the things that God would do for them when they turn to Him appropriately. And then it warns the people what happens if they don't worship God. But there's a special promise for those who turn their lives over to the Lord. It's the last verse, verse 16. But you would be fed with the finest of wheat. With honey from the rock, I would satisfy you. It's kind of a conundrum there. With honey from the rock, I would satisfy you. The lessons of life are usually learned quite gradually, and the lesson on how to deal with difficulties in life aren't taught in school. I never saw a class in high school, college, or seminary on how to deal with difficulty. In fact, if there was such a course offered, I probably wouldn't take it, because we kind of try to avoid those things. At any rate, we might learn this lesson from our parents. That is, if they learned how to deal with life's difficulties, and hopefully we as parents do teach our children that. But most of the time we learn how to deal with difficulties in the school of hard knocks, the place where the rubber meets the road. You know, even when we think that we can handle almost everything in life that life brings to us, we sometimes will find ourselves between the rock and a hard place. And it squeezes. Sometimes it hurts. As parents, my wife and I, Marianne, found ourselves up against the rock one time. It lasted for quite a while. In fact, we're still dealing with it. It's called the empty nest syndrome. Now, all kinds of advice could be given to us on how to deal with that. It's still there. It hasn't gone away yet, has it? Our daughter was visiting over the weekend, and she left to go home last night because she wanted to go to her church. She knew who was preaching here today. At any rate, as Stephanie drove down the driveway, I looked at Marion, and there was stuff running out of her eyes, and she had this funny look on her face that she gets when she's sad. The empty nest. You know, for 20 years or so, we gave the best part of our lives to our kids. Everything that we could give them, we gave them. Emotionally, physically, spiritually. And then one day, they decide they're not going to live with us anymore. We worked ourselves out of a job. How much thanks is that? They don't think of it, but we feel it. And things change. We can't drive over to their place to have a meal for supper and come back home. They're too far away. Our son can't be enticed to bring his laundry home for mom to do anymore. Oh, he's got a wife that does that for him now. And my daughter doesn't bring her car home for me to change oil when it needs it. It's tough. It's tough to make those adjustments. But it's one of those rocks. You know, to be a farmer these days, it's got to be a hard thing. You know, the threat of a crop failure looms over you every time there's a cloud that passes by. You never know what's going to come out of that. I remember visiting with a farmer a few years ago, and I drove up to his yard right after lunchtime, and he came out of the house. He had his combine sitting by the shed there, all ready to go, it looked. And I made a comment to him about going out and starting the harvest. And he says, well, I was going to go out. I had it all ready to go. I was going to go right after lunch. But when I went in for lunch, the white combine came through, and all the beans were knocked out of the hulls, or out of the shells on the field. He says, it's not worth it to even go out there and do anything with it. There's nothing left. Just like that. His crop was damaged, could not be recovered. That happens to farmers. And then, like this year, it looks like they're going to have a great crop. But guess what happened to the market prices? They tanked. What are the farmers going to do? If you can't make money growing corn, grow more corn. Isn't that what they do? Yeah. If you can't make money raising turkeys, raise a few more. Well, that's a rock. We face rocks sometimes dealing with our personal finances. There are hard decisions that have to be made sometimes. Sometimes we have to say no to things that we would really like, that we really want. There can be a rock at work. I know what it's like to have your workload pile up on you so that it just overwhelms you, and you don't seem to be able to get on top of it. That's a rock. Maybe things aren't going well in some relationship that you have with a neighbor or another relative, and that can be a rock. Sometimes it happens in our marriages. We run up a difficulty in relating to our spouse. And as much as I make jokes about Marion and I and our relationship, there are times when it hasn't been so easy. And that can be a rock. But there's a promise that God gives to us. Out of the rock, I will give you honey that will satisfy you. Honey is one of the sweetest substances that there is in nature. Honey out of the rock. Rocks are the hardest things that you can encounter. They don't break easily. Sometimes they don't move. How is it that you get honey out of a rock? Are we supposed to leave here this morning and go, each one of us, pick up a rock and start squeezing it to see if we can get honey out of it? No, that's not what the Bible's talking about here. If we took it literally, we'd be all marched off to some place in Marshall up on the 3rd or 4th floor, you know. Yeah. So we know it's something far richer than that mentioned in this passage. What God is saying is that out of those rock experiences that we have in life, when we crash into that rock or when we trip and stumble and fall over that rock, God wants to bring some sweetness to us that will satisfy us. I always wondered why God didn't just simply go ahead of me and move the rocks out of my way. I would like that. I could really cruise comfortably through life, never have any difficulties, never have to worry about bumping into that rock, tripping over it, falling. Well, I've learned something. God doesn't move the rocks away necessarily. Sometimes He just leaves them there for us. He has a purpose. And the end result is sweetness. You know, that was true of people back in the Old Testament times. You think of a little boy named Joseph. His dad liked him so much he had a coat of many colors given to him to wear to show how much he treasured his son. But that coat of many colors was like a red flag waved in front of a bull when it came to his brothers. They hated him. And one day, they were going to kill him. Threw him in a well, tried to decide how they were going to dispose of him. And they thought, hey, we can make some money off of this when they saw a caravan come by, and they sold him as a slave to the people in the caravan. They hauled him off to Egypt. And there he was a slave in Potiphar's house. He had to wait on people, do things for them, this and that and everything else. Of course, there was no employment involved, so there was no pay. And then Joseph refused to stoop down to disobey God when Potiphar's wife tried to entice him into a relationship. And as a result, he was thrown in prison. Seemingly everybody forgot about him. Years he spent in that prison. He kept seeking the Lord. His relationship with God was not destroyed, obviously. And then one day, there was some sweetness that came out of that situation. I don't tell you the whole story. You can read it for yourself. But God raised him up from that prison to become second in power to Pharaoh himself and ruled over Egypt. In fact, Pharaoh did what Joseph told him to do. That's a pretty high position. That's a wonderful thing. But that wasn't God's purpose. God's purpose was that Joseph would have that position so that he could save his family from disaster when drought occurred in their land. Sweetness out of a rock. 13 years of rocks. And then all of a sudden, things turned around. Took a long time. That's the thing about rocks. You don't get around them or conquer them easily. It takes time. It's not going to happen instantaneously. David had experiences like that. You remember David was anointed by Samuel to be king of Israel. And not only that, but there was a king already in place. His name was Saul. And God allowed Saul to be taken over by a very mean spirit. Saul was trying to kill David. Well, the fun thing was that David was thinking about the palace. And where did he have to move to? Into rocks and caves. And there he ran as a criminal away from the murderous king for years. Quite a palace, he thought. Not a place he'd like to be. But things turned around. And David did eventually become king of Israel. But I want you to know that out of those terrible experiences that he had in the caves and in the rocks, most of the Psalms that we have in our Bibles were written by David out of those tough experiences that he faced. How many times have we been discouraged and we turned our Bible and we read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want"? How many times? David discovered that. It's recorded for us to be our encouragement. And so we see that there's something about character development and maturity that comes when we encounter those rocks. And God wants us to guide us through that experience so we can become more like himself, holy, and we can become mature.